this. Thank you.
There. Now I can say things safely.
Yes, safely say them or not.
Yeah, and so some of the people I've been able to learn from have helped me expand my understanding of development. And that's really what I want to share, is how I'm linking that with this notion of the inner development goals. And what I would love to do is just start with, well, do we do a round, Julia, or?
Whatever you want. Do you want to send them off into the ether, or would you like them here?
No, there's not so many here. Just very quick, but what I'd like to hear from people is, what is your degree, like from 1 to 10, of familiarity with the inner development goals? Because I know they have a website, they have stuff going on. And then also, what is your degree of familiarity with Kurt Fisher's dynamic skill theory on a 1? So that's kind of what I'm looking for, is just to calibrate how the two things that I'd like to engage people with, what kind of familiarity there is. And so if we were to, oh, we got more joining us, so nice. To go around, Miriam's first on my list, and then Helena and Tessa. Hi, Miriam.
Hi, good morning from beautiful Vermont, where it's sunny, gorgeous, and magnificent. And I'm indoors, looking out. My familiarity is short, and I'm here to learn more about it and hear about it. I've seen you in the adult development community, and here I am.
Hey, cool. Helena and Tessa, and then Jonathan.
Mine is hello. Mine is about 0 and 0, but I was curious, and yeah, just piqued my curiosity, the advertisement for today, and I haven't been to Supervision for a long time, so I was glad to be able to attend and learn.
And where are you from?
We're in Cape Town, and Helena's my mother, and she's visiting from Johannesburg.
Oh, okay, I've been to
My sister's
Joburg.
in Vermont at the moment, Miriam.
Great. Okay, Jonathan, and then Jenny.
And I'm also a 0-0.
Okay, good.
So, hi, I'm Jonathan in New York City in the US, and I'm going to be generous and rate myself a 2 on the inner development goals, and maybe a 2.5 to 3 on Fisher, and 9 or 10 on curiosity.
Okay, excellent. Jenny and then Penny. Oh, we're rhyming.
Yes.
Even.
Good morning, everyone. I am sitting here in Northern California. It's a little overcast and cool. And I am aware, inner development goals, probably 1 or 2. I'm aware of them, but that's pretty much it. And Kurt Fisher's dynamic skill theory, 0.
Okay. Penny and then Sarah Ann.
So I'm jealous of Jenny, of your weather. I'm in Washington, D.C., and it is hot and humid and sticky and not my favorite time in DC. I am, now that I've heard of inner development goals, at a 0. I think before this call I was a -1. I've never heard of it before, which now I'm looking at the website. It's very interesting. So, and I used the I'm pretty familiar. Let's see, what would I be? Maybe, what's the scale? 1 to 10?
1 to 10. I think you'd be fairly familiar.
Okay. Like, I used it in my research, my dissertation research, so I'm pretty familiar with it.
Great. Okay, Sarah and then Kate.
So I'm in Johannesburg, and I would also give myself a 0 and a 0.
Okay, that was easy. Kate, and then, oh, I'm going to be name challenged here. Netyat Yambo. Okay. All right.
So I'm Kate and I'm based in Cape Town, and I would say I'm also a 0 and a 0. But I'm here, Jonathan, because the supervision sessions with you have been fascinating before, and you bring so much rich insight that I knew I shouldn't miss it. Unfortunately, I do have a client session in 45 minutes though, so apologies that I'm going to drop off early.
Okay, we'll try to get the best stuff in first.
Fabulous. Thank you.
Okay, Nityambo, and then
Nice.
Alistair.
No, good. E for effort, Jonathan. Well done. That was a good stab at it. Hello, everybody. My name is Njatyambo. I am based in Johannesburg. I am as familiar as the inner development goals as the link you shared that was shared as part of the advertisement for supervision. So watched the video, played around on the website, super interested, and a 0 on the dynamic skills theory.
Okay, Alistair and then Mark.
I'd rate myself on Alistair in Cape Town. I'd rate myself on a 9 and a -1. The reason behind that is they had the SDGs, right? And they thought they would achieve them without working on their inner game. So finally they've caught up. So things like coaching, therapy, etc., vertical development, they've basically chopped it up into 5 IDGs. So it's more of the same. It's just that, that crew of people at the UN have finally caught up to the wave. And then when I got the link for this session, I looked up that field theory. I watched a few videos. It didn't make sense at all. So yeah, hence the -1. So
Okay.
I'm really keen to learn more about it.
Confused.
Exactly.
Excellent. Great. Okay, Mark, and then I can't remember the name
Maya.
behind the long phone number.
Maya.
Okay. Yeah. Hey, Mark.
Hi guys. I'm in Cape Town, and definitely a 0 on both. So looking forward to learning and hearing more.
Okay, Maya.
Hi. So up until now, I was a 0 and 0. I'm looking at both of them online, and I imagine that there's a lot of overlap with. I have a background in human development and psychology, and so I imagine there's a lot of overlap with the skills theory, and then the what is this? The inner development goals. I'm new to it, but I'm looking at it now, and it looks very familiar. So that's where I stand. Thank you.
Great. And what about you, Julia?
You introduced me to the inner development goals quite a while ago, and I read them very avidly and even read newspaper articles about them, and in particular what was happening in, I think it was Sweden. And in between that time and now, I've had COVID and a holiday. So I'm not quite sure how I can rate myself for this. So I will go with an easy, and just, I'm just taking a bit of facilitator rank here. I'll go for a 4.
Oh, very good. Okay. But that's super helpful for me, just to calibrate on how to approach and what kind of pace to go. Also, I thought I should put this in before I forget, because the book I edited that Penny has a chapter in is out in paperback finally, so it's actually more affordable. So that's, if you want to read about all sorts of different approaches to adult development in relation to leadership, there's all sorts of goodies in here. So I'll start with, how do I say, it was really interesting to listen to Alistair's story of the inner development goals. And I've had other people mention similar orientations. Actually, it was somebody from a telecom in Stockholm last week that I was talking with that had a similar orientation. And I have maybe a little different story. So 8 years ago, there were some of us invited to do a debrief at an island in the Stockholm archipelago owned by a man named Thomas Björkman, the Ekshard Foundation. And Thomas Jordan, a friend of mine and another developmental theorist who lives in Sweden, was going to be doing a workshop a couple days later. And so Thomas got this idea that he could get Thomas Jordan and I to kind of facilitate and design a 2-day event, and he'd invite all sorts of interesting, diverse people, and we would see what happened. And what happened was a lot of chaos and mess. It was really challenging and sticky, but it had some traction. So 2 years later, they decided to do it again, but be a little more intentional and invite people who are all already familiar with adult development models. And this was around the time I ran into Thomas Björkman, who's a philanthropist who, you know, had made his career in, he was the CEO or chairman of the board of a Swiss bank at one point. He had real estate and these kind of things. So this is how he could fund this kind of things. And I ran into him at Schiphol Airport at the security line, and he was so excited. He said, "Look what I'm reading." And he pulled Suzanne Cook-Greuter's dissertation out of his backpack. So he's somebody who's really into this. And so he brought, and there's about 20, this is an island that is kind of really 2 hours out of Stockholm, off the grid, so to speak, a bit, not quite, but off. It has electricity and Wi-Fi, but you can walk around the island in 15 minutes. This was a little bit more focused, but out of it came this notion of, I think they called it at the time, the adult development conspiracy. And the idea was, how can we get these ideas out into the mainstream? How can we support this kind of work going, you know, legitimate, so to speak? And 2 years later, they managed to talk Robert Keegan into coming over. And they arranged an event in Stockholm, a public event. I think they had to move venues. About 300 people showed up. Robert was there, Suzanne, Christian Stolna presented, I presented, a bunch of us, some people from some corporations, and they got this article into the main Swedish newspaper. They got a series of editorials over that summer, and this launched this idea of growth that matters, I think they called it at that point. They were trying to find ways to package adult development or ego development theory or developmental theory in general into some way that was palatable to the general public. And then the next year there was another event, bigger, more people came. I think it became mind shift was the term then. They got Peter Senge, Otto Scharmer, but of course COVID hit and everything had to be online suddenly. But they had like 1,500 people show up for this. And along the way, they made a strategic decision to say, rather than just trying to get people to do this, let's connect it to the sustainable development goals, because then you can say inner development, sustainable development, and people make, like Alistair said, it's a no-brainer to say that we can't achieve the sustainable development goals without doing inner work. And a related story is another friend of mine in Oslo, Karen O'Brien, 10, 12, 13 years ago, she was on the International Panel for Climate Change, and she was trying to get integral theory and so on, consciousness into the discourse in the climate change world, and struggled for years, even getting people to use the word. So there's many people have been trying to make this connection and get this kind of into the foreground. And it is somehow this IDG, SDG connection really seems to have hit the mark. It has gained a lot of corporate support, of course, mostly in Scandinavia. So IKEA, Ericsson, Telia, H&M, Spotify, these kind of companies have all signed on and put money into this and are trying to implement these things in their organizations. The government of Costa Rica signed on. We had the Minister of Planning and Development at the last event, which was April 28th in Stockholm. There were 700 people in person and 4,000 online streaming. So that's my version of the story of the inner development goals. Any comments or questions before I then shift gears?
I just want to applaud all of you for getting this going. Like, well done.
It's a lot of volunteer work, let's put it that way.
Like,
But
well
of
done.
course, those of us that are any of us that are involved in this are always looking to see how can we go beyond being geeky, marginalized people to being legitimate and credible. Okay. So then, now let's see, what other strands? So you see on the Inner Development Goals website, there's these 5 categories and 23 goals. So how in the world did this come about? And one of the things that happened 2 years ago now, I think, was they commissioned a study. They sent a survey out. They got reasonable amount of distribution, even though it was centered in Scandinavia. I think about 1,000 people responded, and they asked them, what are the kind of inner capabilities, skills, whatever, that you think are most important to enable people to grow and develop? And they got a big, long list. And Thomas Jordan and another person were responsible then to pull this together and, you know, kind of do thematic sorting, chunking things, got some expert feedback from various people in the field to then come up with this list of 23 in 5 categories. And we're all painfully aware that the list is incomplete, skewed, you know, but it's a place to start. And it at least gets people to become aware of the notion of needing to do some kind of internal work and gives them some categories or names to do that. And now what we're thinking, of course, is very broad. You can imagine all the public servants in Costa Rica are getting exposed to this and saying, we should be working on being and thinking and relating and all these things. Wow, how do we do that? And so the how do we do that is in development, where there's a field kit being worked on. And there's a scientific advisory board of about 25 of us who have been involved in another larger survey, which had better demographic distribution and geographic distribution, which has looked at practices that meet different criteria, you know, have some empirical grounding, have some good training, usability. And so there's a whole body of work being done now to produce a field kit that could be going out to people around the world. Say, if you want to work on our inner development in different areas, here's some options. And so for those of us in this kind of body of work, this gives us a wonderful opportunity to be kind of the pioneers and early adopters when theoretically a big wave of people say, wow, we want to do more of this. Who knows something about us can help us. So that's kind of the broad story of this. Comments, observations?
Sorry, you can tell me to shut up. I know I'm very excited about the toolkit because I think that might be a really interesting cornerstone to our leadership development programs. And because a lot of our work is in state-owned enterprises, I'm actually getting some quiet thrills on the side about what we can do with that. So I'm going to write you an email for one of those kits.
So the field kit is due to come out the 20th of September. That's the current launch date. Jonathan, you're unmuted.
So two things. One, well, three. One, this is great. Two, I'm wondering, is there something already that outlines to folks, and if you're able to increase these, here's what's likely to be different?
It's a good question. It makes sense. I suspect there are things going on with that. I know, for instance, there are a number of interrelated endeavors. For instance, CADRA is an Erasmus Plus EU funded project looking at adult development. 29K is an organization that is trying to produce very simple online apps interventions for people, and I think they have some of that kind of stuff. If you want to have more inner calm, if you want to have more quality of relationship and it want to look like this, here's practices, here's little things you can do. But I don't know myself of a kind of comprehensive kind of guide to that at the moment.
Okay. I mean, I think that would be interesting in terms of why bother to people who aren't already convinced. And there are very good reasons to bother, but it may not be clear. And then the third thing was, I was thinking about how, for example, the Center for Creative Leadership has this huge 360 assessment. And, you know, for companies who are willing to pay more, they can customize and say, these are the competencies we want to focus on. And there are 35 of these things, which is a lot to try to do at once. So I'm wondering about something similar in terms of, okay, how do we help folks figure out which are the most important for where you want to get to?
So that's a great segue into some slides and some things I want to share, because I think this is my first inclination as well to say, well, okay, if I want to get better here, what do I do? And as I mentioned, I've had the opportunity, I seek out people to learn from, let's put it that way. So Theo Dawson has been one, but Mike Mascolo is another. And Mike Mascolo worked with Kurt Fisher quite a lot. And I've been able to have a lot of conversations where I've started to understand that actually the kind of development that we're looking for doesn't require this kind of explicit move to go out. And maybe because it's really, that's a perfect setup, Jonathan. If I go like this, so this is basically the same slides that Mike and I used back in January when we did this for the inner development goals. And the, so what's happening here? No, what happened now? Come on. Oh yeah, there it is. Okay. So look, this idea that we tend to look for solutions in programs designed by experts. And the message is, don't do that. Because development is hidden in plain sight. You know, all these opportunities to grow and develop are all around us all the time. Alistair likes this. So what is really the challenge is, how do we develop our capacity to see opportunities for development? And one of our favorite phrases from Keegan and Leahy, right? They're not problems for us to solve, but problems that can solve us. So it's looking at solutions, looking at issues that way. So what that does is to say, okay, so there's 23 really great inner development goals. It's a bit overwhelming, as you say, like whether it's the leadership circles, 18 competencies and 11 reactive tendencies, or the Center for Creative Leadership's 35 competencies, or all these models. It can be overwhelming for the average person. So the thing is, skills develop in the middle of everyday life. And so thinking that we need to go out and do stuff actually adds more stress and gets in the way. Now, what's a simple definition of development? Progress towards some outcome. And how does it happen? Adapting to things gone wrong, right? It goes back to, I remember Heidegger, you know, if you're using a hammer and it works fine, you don't notice, but as soon as the head flies off and it breaks down, you notice things go wrong. Conflict happens in relationships. And relationships, engaging others, is the main source of our development. So we're developing in the middle of everything, and it's a very simple kind of action reflection cycle. So that's just to set the stage for this kind of thing. If people have questions along the way, please raise your hand physically or with the Zoom thing, or just unmute and interrupt me, please, because, you know, I don't know how to restrain myself. Julia.
Yeah, it's me again. I've got lots, and they include stuff around inclusion, but like, do you really need 23?
So this is, again, the issue. Is it necessary to have 23? This was simply a way of categorizing what the 1,000 or so people who put input into this said was important. And it just fell out into those. Whether it's needed or not, that's a different conversation.
And now, how many of those people, sorry, Jonathan, I have to ask that. How many of those people were from Africa or Asia?
Yeah, so this is what I said. It was a relatively limited survey in the first round. The field kit one has had a broader demographic distribution. I know that there's more people from South America in that one, I believe from Africa. I know they had somebody, really interesting woman from Rwanda at the IDG event. So they're getting better and they're very conscious. So I know when I was at the island right after the last event, the Templeton Foundation had approved a grant to allow them to do some pilot projects in 3 African countries. So they've got networks and connections there and things going on. So, so they are working on trying to address that issue very consciously.
Great.
Okay, so 5 categories.
Oh, Penny, did you want to say something?
Oh.
Well, I'm trying to make sense of this, and it seems to me that even though, you know, all of these skills or capabilities are overwhelming, what it invites individuals to do is it provides some sense making and guidance to what one's environment is requiring of them. So, and what one's environment is requiring of you actually can provide direction to which of these skills should be focused on more consciously. Does that make sense at all?
Yep. And so as I'm listening to that, one of the things that I see, and I just put the list up here now of the categories and the goals underneath. We all have conceptions and perceptions. So when we're encountering our environment, other people, situations, we make meaning and sense of it through the kind of mental model schemas, you know, concepts that we have. And this is essentially a list of concepts that are categorized in a way to look like goals. Now, self-awareness, presence, long-term orientation, optimism, humility, we can call them whatever, but essentially they are conceptions of some facet of human experience that is seen as valuable to develop and grow with. And people will maybe find 2 or 3 that connect and they go, oh, that would be helpful for me. So it's kind of like a user guide orientation map to invite that. Now, at the same time, the challenge is often people would look at that and say, oh God, I got to tick the box. I've got to work on all these. That's, you know, it's like, wow, great goals, but I feel a bit like this. It's, you know, it's overwhelming. So let's make it less overwhelming and think of it like a reference desk. You know, what things might be relevant in relation to situations you face. And we'll get into that in a little bit. So, and the idea is to then take that and kind of park it there like that, and then look at some adult development theory. And I know that there are varying degrees of familiarity with different models, whether it's Keegan's or Lovinger, Suzanne Torbert, Rook, all these, or maybe Elliot Jacques' model. There's Terry O'Fallon's. There's a lot of models that are looking primarily at the sense of self and how our sense of self and making sense of the world evolves. This is not that. So this is skill theory. Oh, there. And originally, so now this is just a quick kind of lineage thing. Skill theory came from Kurt Fischer. His first paper was 1980. He was a student of Lawrence Kohlberg's. Kohlberg took Piaget's developmental work and applied it to moral development. I studied Kohlberg's moral development theory in high school. We were exposed to it in Canada, let alone. So you got skill theory that went to, then it was kind of called dynamic skill theory. And what Fischer was really trying to do is say, there's something going on inside us in terms of how we learn to perform in the world, but there's also something in the world that is providing a context for us to perform. So behaviorism is all about how does the environment condition us? And Fischer really tried to link these elements together in a really elegant way. So it's called dynamic skill theory, and then it became integrative developmental science, which is this great fat handbook that Mike Muscolo and Thomas Bedell edited. And here is this notion that a skill refers to the capacity to control elements of acting, thinking, and feeling within particular contexts and psychological domains. So it's a very broad conception of skill. And one of the things about this that has been helpful for me is to understand this is not a, how to say, cognitive in the sense of intellectual. It actually says that affect or emotion is the primary driver of how we perform, where our attention goes. So it's very integrative in that sense. And Fischer's conceptual inputs was Piaget, right? How cognitive structures develop, Skinner's operant conditioning, but also Albert Bandura's notion of social learning, that we learn through modeling and imitation. No, I'll do one more and then I'll stop and breathe for a moment, right? These are some really key principles, because in most of the developmental theories that I became familiar with, one of the things you look at was a person's center of gravity. Here, the first principle is variability of performance. That how we engage the world varies depending upon our inner condition, external circumstances, need, all sorts of things. So that's fundamental. It's localized, it's contextual, it's relational, and it's saying that there are no general or all-purpose psychological structures. Although they undergo massive development over the lifespan, psychological structures consist of localized skills tied to particular situational demands, psychological domains, and social contexts. Okay, now I'll pause and see what how much have I lost people so far?
Yeah.
Looking good. Miriam's happy.
Yeah.
Tessa's happy. Kate's happy.
No.
This is Maya. I don't know how to raise my hand on the phone.
Just jump in then.
Yeah, thanks. So my thoughts are going off in my mind like fireworks, because I see such a connection. I so appreciate what you just shared, because it's drawing in things that I reference, like from my perspective, which is attachment theory, and especially just in the last year and a half, a lot of focus on regulating the nervous system, which can be rooted as far back as childhood, but also just, I've had a lot of clients, even more recently, that are dealing with ADHD. For some reason, I've attracted a lot of clients with that. And just sort of like at the baseline, how we regulate ourselves, just to me, that underlies all of this. And I find it so fascinating how a lot of theories don't start with that. A lot of the trauma therapies are, just starting to notice more and more that at the root of all of it is a calm nervous system. And what made me think of this is under the, the skills development, under being, under self-awareness, it lumps awareness with regulation. And I actually think those are two separate things. I think someone can be very aware and have difficulty regulating if they don't have skills around regulation.
I totally agree. So I've been reading a lot of neuroscience lately, like Lisa Feldman Barrett and other people. And a lot of this is understanding that, and if you see, and I don't show it here, Fisher's skill scale, it starts with sensory motor reflexes. How does the infant's central nervous system learn to operate a body, learn to be aware of its environment? And all of these things are developing, and it's not until you get to, I think in his scale, like level 6, that language even begins to come in. The idea that you represent a bunch of physical sensory motor things with a word, and then how those words evolve in complexity and how you use them and build maps between different terms and build systems of them and make abstractions and map those together and build systems of them and so on. That is also tied to, now I'm trying to weave back to this distinction. The thing about executive function, or Theo talks about the active observer, or Wilbur talks about the witness self, there is that kind of metacognition. The most recent book I finished was called Know Thyself, The New Science of Self-Awareness. It's a neuroscientist from England. And it's very clear that it agrees with what you're saying, Maya, that we need to notice things, but it's a different skill to then learn how to take something from awareness into bringing a skill in relation to it, choosing what to do, having the resources and capacity to actually follow through and do it. What is really interesting to me is all of that happens in micro levels, and we're not now dealing with big broad patterns. And what I remember is that the challenge when reading Keegan 25 years ago or something, is like, to go from a socialized mind to a self-authored mind is like 5 years if you really work at it and use good practices. I think, whoa, okay, so how do I work with that? And what I've come to appreciate with this is you get more and more granular. And what we're getting into now working with this is micro skills that people can practice in 30 seconds in context. But that's jumping ahead. But I certainly appreciate what you're saying, Maya. All these things fit together more and more.
Thank you.
I'm gonna
Jonathan?
Yeah.
Yeah, my question is, did I hear you right saying that you were initially of the understanding that one center of gravity is the one that influences, I think, their rate of learning or something, and now you're of the belief that it's their emotional state or something like that? Can you just clarify that bit?
That's a good question. That's a open big can of worms kind of question. Excellent. I would say this, that my perception is that like anything, when you encounter a new set of distinctions, a new lens to make sense of things, at first you have it's a blunt instrument. So if you say that Keegan has 5 levels and you just look at those, you can make 5 distinctions. But then you learn after a while that there's stages between stages and you can make finer, but that's harder to do. What I think helps with learning, there's many things involved. What Maya said, psychological safety, learning emotions. So I work with Lectica's tools a lot, and there's a big emphasis on understanding what kind of emotions we have in relation to learning. How do we create environments that allow us to be curious rather than fearful? And I'm not sure if I'm answering your question exactly, but what I see when I get into this dynamic skill theory and a more integrative understanding is that all of these things are playing a role at a much more granular micro level, so that you're not necessarily talking about go do this for 6 months. You're saying, here's this tiny little practice we can break down and work on that, for the next 2 weeks over, like you notice something happens and take 30 seconds to try something out. I can show you some stuff related to this a little bit later. As we were listening to a podcast the other day, my wife and I, from Theo Dawson, and she said, well, the challenge is trying to talk about this in this kind of format. Here we have 2 hours, which seems long, but if we had 2 months, we would be able to scratch the surface. Let's put it that way. So I don't know if that answered your question, Alistair, or raised more questions. Okay, we get the thumbs up. So let me go a little bit further and just see if we can put some more pieces in place to maybe go into breakouts and discuss at some point. So this is just a picture screenshot from this book. And it's a way of looking at development that isn't a ladder, saying we go through steps and stages, but it's saying that performance is variable. And what we know is that, I listened to a new podcast with Daniel Kahneman 2 days ago or last night. Oh, it was wonderful. Things that are automatic for us, that we can do under stress, that we can do in almost any context, that are really habituated. That's a level of performance that is very kind of dependable for us. And then there's a level of performance that's functional. We need to put some attention on it. And in many circumstances, we can perform a certain skill, whether it's maybe framing a good communication, or helping regulate our emotions in a situation, whatever it is. But if we notice we need to do it, we can do it reasonably well. And then there's an optimal level, which is if we've slept well, ate well, are feeling good, and it's sunny out, and the environment and relations and people we're with are good, we can perform really at an optimal level. We're in the zone. And lastly, there's a scaffolded level. And the scaffolded level is skills we can perform with support, with assistance, whether it's a coach, a mentor, a helper of some kind. Unlike my little laser pointer here. Now, what's harder to see maybe, if we're looking at development, is we can say that, I gotta look at this carefully myself. Right, so we talk about a developmental range and a zone of proximal development. So those of you that might have heard of Vygotsky, this idea of a zone of proximal development, something that is outside of our normal habituated skill level, but it's not so far outside that we really wouldn't have a clue to do it. And you see how, if you imagine these lines as different types of skills, we have more or less ability in them, and our developmental range will depend upon what is functional, what is optimal, what is possible with support. So this is another way of looking at development rather than just having a kind of linear ladder.
Jonathan, I'm wondering if just bringing in, my area of focus, which is coaching skill development, if everyone were to think way back to the beginning when you had your coach training, and how, there was probably some sort of falling apart, which would be considered a Fisher's dip, before you were able to reassemble those skills. Like, wow, why is it I can't ask a question anymore? It's because those structures are falling apart in order to be reassembled in a more complex way. And I see this in my coaching students all the time. There's just a predictable pattern of development of so many skills under pressure, with support, with that scaffolding. And then if you were to, fast forward to today and think about who you are as a coach, and how, in many ways it's almost like falling off a ladder, and you have to bring yourself back and make yourself more conscious for every session. I don't know if that helps make sense of these multiple overlapping skills and how they come together in more complex ways.
It made sense for me. And I think it brought out something very important, because any of these models are talking about learning, essentially. How do we learn to perform? How do we learn to walk? We fall down 1,000 times. And anytime we undertake, or basically how I hear what Penny's talking about is, when we encounter the limits of our ability to meet the demands or expectations of a given context, when our skill performance level isn't adequate, we need to learn something new. And what we often need to start with is unlearning how we've done things, because there's a lot of implicit building blocks in play that we need to prune. Some of them we might be able to use, but maybe they need to be put together with something else. So there's an unlearning component, pruning skills, developing. So maybe let's look at what we mean by development here. And sorry that you have to leave, Kate. Okay, so and now I'm borrowing shamelessly from Mike Muscolo. He's great at making slides, much better than I am at it. So progress towards an outcome, right? And it's not just growth. It's not just more of the same or getting bigger. So he has this idea, okay, it's not just getting bigger. It's not just having longer hair, more of, or filling a container with more information or knowledge. But this is often how we look at it. We just get more of something we already have. And then development is different than growth in that way. So when something develops, it's being formed and undergoes transformation, right? And this is the thing that I learned early. What is the structure of how we relate to the contents of our experience? How do we organize that? Oh, I'm trying to, oh, yes, I should be able to hand out the slides. I think Mike's okay with that. So yes. Okay. So if you take a seed of a peach and you put it in the ground, a seed comes out. This is a different structure, right? The seed is one thing, but it goes in the ground, it decomposes essentially, it loses its structure, and a new structure comes out, and then it grows, and it has even new things like flowers and blossoms, and then it has fruit. So the structure changes over time, and new parts are differentiated from old parts. And the new parts become increasingly integrated to make each new whole. So, yeah, we can share these. So, development is differentiating new parts and putting them together to form something new. This is basically what Penny was saying about coaching. Your skills break down, so you have to kind of fumble around and find something else. You have to connect it in some way. And a lot of this is about making new neural connections. And this is why we're focusing these days more on micro skill learning, because that's much more tangible. It's much more doable to make these kind of connections. And this is a picture from Keegan's Evolving Self, right? It's what happens when you develop yourself. You develop new and better versions of yourself that emerge from the old. You literally bring a new version of yourself into existence. Okay, so how does it happen? This has come back to this important thing. A, when things go wrong, right? There is, what I say, when things go wrong, the simple way I like to look at this is we have an expectation towards other people in the world, and then things don't happen that way. So what were we thinking? What were they thinking? You know, some kind of conflict emerges. And it's when we have to figure this out. This is essentially, maybe you've heard of Piaget's central themes of assimilation and accommodation. Assimilation is basically we take some experience we have and we can fit it into how we already structure what we know. But accommodation is when we can't do that and we have to grow our structure in some way. We have to accommodate new knowledge or information. So when there's conflict and things go wrong, then it challenges us to say, what don't we know? What else are we missing? What do we need to add to our existing structures? What new connections do we need to make? But it also happens through our relationships with others. So here's me and you, and there's some little animations here, right? And then somehow we grow. It's a very crude representation, but this idea that the interaction changes our own understanding. And then it happens in the middle of everything. So here's this little image of, you know, an organizational culture. He's me and you, and here's an employee, and there is, you know, stuff going on. We're vibrating or whatever. And then we're over here, and let's see, there's a client comes into the picture, and how do we deal with this? So how do we put all this together? Mike would be able to tell you better all these things, but what's important here is if we look at this and say, okay, if we are a boss and we have these inner development goals in our backpack, that's what just the little text there is just, you know, the being, thinking, relating, collaborate, acting, those five, they're just in there in the background. And we have an employee and we need them to do something. And the first thing we say is, hey, can you do this? Right? That makes sense. An employee says yes. But what they actually do is they resent it because they're being told what to do. So we say, I say do this, but and because it has to be done, but I get resistance. What's going on? So how now the person's having to reflect. They're taking this and say, okay, something wasn't meeting my expectation, or I encountered something I have to accommodate. So now I go up and I think, okay, if I state the problem, we have to figure out a way to serve clients faster. Can you do this? You give a bit of framing, Torbert's 4 parts of speech, right? You don't make them read your mind. You share some reasoning. Oh, and they maybe say, yes, there's less resentment. You get compliance. Okay, that's better. But maybe there's less resentment, but flat affect. There's no real buy-in or engagement. No enthusiasm. So you're reflecting again. You chunk this. Say, what happens if I reflect even further? And if I state the problem and ask for solutions? Does anyone have suggestions on how we can serve the clients faster? You get some enthusiasm because people are engaged. They're being asked their ideas. Oh, we could do this. Oh, I get more ideas and enthusiasm. So this is a quick way to look at developmental progression from making a demand to doing 2 things, stating a problem and getting compliance, a little more sophisticated, to stating a problem, asking for solutions, right? It's increasing complexity from authority to perspective taking to actual collaboration. And if you have this kind of progression, you touch on about 10 of these inner development goals. They're all developing in the middle of a situation. By supporting, and maybe you're coaching this person to reflect on, okay, I did this and this is what happened was it's not what you wanted. It's not, so how does that go forward? So, right, where do new ideas come from? Not from the outside in, not from the inside out. They come from in between. And directing your own development, Mike's got a nice model, right? Acting and experiencing, just reflection on action over and over. And so you have this whole cycle of action. You have concepts and skills, cognition. You have action. You reflect on those things. You notice things. You look for counterexamples. You experiment, and you revise. And that's how your ideas operate in the world. You go through all these kind of things. This is just basically what we described. and you make observations. I want to get to the end of the slide so we can discuss and talk, and I'll share these later, right? You have a belief, you notice stuff, you didn't need to do this, you notice something else, you make observations. I don't feel the need to control people. You experiment with novel ideas. Yeah, too many slides. Okay, there we go. I think we can get to the end of that. Okay. Just to give you an idea of how nuanced and complex, how many pieces there are playing in here, the idea basically is to say that we don't need to look outward in the world to some experts, some models and theories, even like this. What we need to learn is how to pay attention to our own experience, essentially metacognition. How do we use a simple cycle? So Lectica uses this V-call notion, where you look at something, I want to figure this out. What do I need to know to figure it out that I don't know now? How do I test it out in small doses? And how do I reflect on that to revise the goal? And you just do that iteratively. Okay. What do you think, Julie? Do we just sit here and talk, or do we throw people into small groups and let them be more confused there, or?
I like a little small group, but I've got a question. Can I ask it?
I don't know.
So-
What if you, should we let her ask the question, or do we
No,
want to go in
say
small
no.
groups
Just
first?
say no. I tell you what is happening in my head is like this this business of how you aggregate collections of words and at what level it's best to present words for digestion. So like you've got that word, say being, and then there's words underneath it. So you could either present all of the 23 or you could just present 5. And then those 5 need to embody all of the stuff that you make of it. And sort of, okay, it might be mad or not useful, but I tell you where it's going, is this idea of, I mean, we're pretty obsessed with inclusion down here.
Mm-hmm.
And we see that as fundamental to making the world work a little bit more effectively. So that is like a word that relies on a lot of those subwords that you had there. So do you express this as a bag of words or a word?
So to develop us, I'll just say this briefly and I'll share something here for a moment. To do this, one thing that I think is very important about what you're saying is, and because I wrote a blog post for Mike, that we generally develop through encountering otherness.
Yes.
And there's many forms of otherness. And the opportunity there, of course, is to question our conception of the world, to expand it, to have to accommodate and grow our conception of what is possible in the world, what is useful for people and so on. But now, if you say, okay, all the DEI people that I know, we're working on inclusion. Well, how do you do that? How do you build skills? That's such a big thing. So let's take something like collaboration, right? How do you collaborate with others? One of the things that Theo has done is build what she calls skill maps. And these are provisional. These are not fixed in stone, but they are an example of how you take something like collaboration and say, well, what's involved? Well, you need self-regulation. You need communication. You need to take perspectives. You need to seek perspectives. But if you're regulating yourself, you need to cultivate open-mindedness. And that requires this and this. And you see a whole host of skills around the outside that are much more micro. And if so, one of the things we're working on now with somebody that I know that works in intellectual property and serious gaming is to create games for people to work on navigating a map like this to understand what of these skills do I already feel somewhat competent with, and which ones should I focus on learning in more micro skills to build up a more robust area. So if I want to collaborate with others, I see that there's a lot of things involved and I can work on small little things. And if I work on 10 of these over the next year, I'll probably be a better collaborator. So the same would happen with inclusion. Here's one on perspective coordination. Right, same type of deal. Let's just a minute. I've got, no, I don't have so many of these open. Let's see, this is evaluating information. Oh, here's one on self-mastery. You got to manage your behaviors, your thoughts, your emotions, learning, values, biases. The ones that are in green are ones we noticed in a project we did coming up in people. So this is just more toys and tools.
But that's what's interesting is it feels like the maturity of this way of thinking comes in at a particular level in the adult development network or topology. And I'm just wondering that if you do enough of this stuff at this particular level, it bounces it up to the next one. Sort of in my experience, it looks very strategizing, but if you bounce it together, it goes into transforming.
Yeah, so I think what you're talking about is essentially what I understand of Fisher's skill theory is that you take a bunch of cognitive skills that you can perform at a given level. For instance, children learn arithmetic and you can perform addition and then you can perform subtraction. And eventually you can do multiplication and division. And you can get more and more sophisticated and doing this with bigger and bigger numbers. And eventually you go from the concrete operational thing of using specific numbers to an abstract skill of being able to do algebra, where X can stand for any number. And you chunk all those little things into a higher order function. And the same thing happens with all these micro skills. You bundle them together and get good at them, and they chunk up into more higher order performance, and they become internalized. So in system one, they become automatic. And you just think, oh, I have to be a better listener now. And that means I need to look intent. I need to slow my thinking down. I need to attend to what the person's saying. All that becomes automated and habituated.
Yeah, and maybe that answers the question of the 23. Maybe, you know, the model can be expressed on developmental levels from 23 to 2, with
Good
later
question.
levels only having 2 aggregating words.
Good question, but I think we should put people in groups and let them talk for a minute.
Okay. No, I prefer to dominate. Jonathan, I'm very childish at times.
You're such an 8.
Jonathan, I have a comment and a question. I'm curious if we can, if I can address it before we go into groups.
Sure.
Is that possible? Okay. So first of all, I'm giddy with this material. I adore it. Yeah, thank you so much for introducing me to the inner development framework. I'm loving it. A couple of comments about stuff that you said. So one, first and foremost, you were talking about the book, Know Thyself. And there's a saying that is coming to mind for me, which is, you have to have a healthy ego before you can have no ego. And I think so much of these processes fall into sort of both of those categories. Where else was I going to go with it?
Well, and I'll just say
Okay,
on that point, I'll just say in the work I do, we often tell people you need to clean up before you can grow up.
Yes, yes, yes. Thank you. So that actually reminded me, I was going to speak to how you mentioned that a lot of times the process begins with an unlearning. And so I've heard so much of that most recently. And I also believe that there's a piece that gets omitted from that, which is that I think there's a process of reclaiming too, is that there are parts of ourselves that have become dormant, that in the letting go of what doesn't serve, we also are reclaiming what we do want to bring forth. What else is, I'll just move to my question because I'm blanking on my other thoughts. So my question is, one of the most common things that I find in working with executives and leaders is that their schedules are, especially of startups, is that their schedules are so busy that finding the time for self-reflection is, that has to be a habit that's built in, and it tends to be the first thing that falls aside when they're focused on the day-to-day. And so oftentimes, like, I will have access to a leader and I'll be coaching them, and I might be working with them around this, but I truly believe, like, we can't lead others where we haven't been before. And so my question is, in like mid-sized organizations or smaller organizations, which is where I focus, where I'm only coaching the leader, but I don't have access to coaching other team members, how might, because as you were speaking, I was thinking, well, this would be great if they could be introducing this into their daily processes, like even their meetings and how they're doing things. Like you gave an example and I can't remember, but I was just thinking about it. And so how might one go about influencing or evolving, moving beyond it just being the leader? Because I believe that it takes a process and a time. You were mentioning, several years and stuff for a leader themselves to evolve like this, or a human. I'm curious how you might suggest integrating some of these practices or skills building or just inherent ways that it could be infused in a culture if one doesn't have access to the whole team.
Well, it's a great question, and the real answer is it depends. And I would have to figure it out. And why I say that is simply that there's so many variables in terms of what might be the context, what might be possible, what's in that person's reach, what's outside, what can they control, and what can't they, so there's so many things to deal with that for me, it would take a lot more kind of question and exploration to find with that person, where could they practice something simple? Where could they try something like introducing an after action review at meetings, take 5 minutes at the end of an hour and just say, hey, what did we set out to do and how well did we do about it? Just little, but you have to really find out where people are at and what's possible in their context.
Jonathan?
No, I'm going to try again. Netyet Ambo has got her hand up.
Thank you. Thanks, Jonathan. Yeah, my brain has many thoughts, and I'm hoping my comment is going to be clear enough for you to comment on. I'm still sort of connecting it in my head. But what you've been talking about is so fascinating. And in my head, I'm linking it to some stuff I've been reading around African cosmology in particular. And I'm just thinking how could it look different if you look at an African cosmology perspective, there tends to be a foundation that comes from an us lens. Whereas if you look from a Western perspective, and maybe I'm noticing it in these IDGs as well, is that there's quite a me lens. And so I'm thinking, like, how does it look different? How would it look different if you came from the other side? And could that not contribute to what Julia was saying? Because I think of a concept of my particular people, the Bantu people, known as Ubuntu. Without overlaying too long on what Ubuntu is, but Ubuntu can link you into humanity, it links you into nature, it links you into animals, it links you into spirit, when you kind of understand the cosmology of Ubuntu as a whole. And it takes this very complex idea and simplifies it into these 4 simple notions, and then translates it into a way of being for people, and links in many of these 23 goals, but from a us perspective as opposed to a me perspective.
I think that's wonderful. And I'll just make some random associations and thoughts and see if that's helpful. One, first of all, it reminded me of an article I read many years ago. It's in the Journal of Business Ethics, and it's called I Am We Dialogue, as a practice of business ethics. And basically, it described some examples. Like there was a guy who ended slavery in Pennsylvania and New Jersey in the 1700s by a Quaker who went around talking to people. And the method he used was to establish the common usness before looking at the issue. So rather than it's me and you and the issue between us, it's like, who are we together? What do we have in common that we can recognize? And then how do that we-ness look together at this issue? And there were lots of examples of that. And Robert Greenleaf was an example of using that. So that's the first thing that came to my mind. And it is true that it's a very individualistic Western thing. I think that my understanding of Ubuntu, I remember somebody in my PhD program 20 years ago was studying that. So I learned little bits about it. But it gives you a different platform or a different kind of underlying lens. And at the same time, I think it's kind of like Julia was saying, there's many things that it means. So how do you unpack that? So you said, then there's a layer of 4 things, maybe. You can make a skill map about it. What do each of those 4 things take to, what are distinct little sub-skills or building blocks you need to do those 4 things? And how could you break that down so that people could not feel overwhelmed by this? Ubuntu is different than what I'm used to in the West, but there's something I'm curious about. How can I find something I can kind of engage or get my head around to work with? Does that make sense?
Yes, thank you. Thank you. Thank you for commenting on that. Thanks. Cool.
Jonathan, you were going to say something.
Yes, and sorry, I didn't see the hand. I apologize. I just wanted to, I was thinking about what Maya was bringing up and the idea of scaffolding and looking at to what degree are we able to scaffold the business leader to do this with his or her team, or where might we have an opening, and sometimes we don't, but to work with the team, even if it's just once and not the whole engagement, to scaffold the work there. So maybe there are some additional opportunities.
It made me think of, I was watching some video of Edgar Schein talking about it, and he said, well, he was at this company and he was watching them have meetings. They wanted more effective meetings, and he's just observing, and he observed a pattern of interrupting each other. And then he tried pointing that out and said, well, they ignored that. But then when he said, oh, somebody interrupted, and he said, oh, excuse me, I'm trying to capture ideas. Could you remind me what you just said? Oh, okay. And they would do that. And then and that changed their pattern of interaction by just asking them questions about things. So figuring out what kind of skillful interventions to make often is very spontaneous, but it's in noticing what is breaking down in the relationships in a given context. What are unconscious patterns of, I would say, Argyris would say, skilled incompetence in a team? And how can you redirect people's attention and or offer practices? Now, the challenge, if you offer too complex a practice, then it requires too much scaffolding or support. So how do you make it fit in the Goldilocks zone where they can actually take it on, or they actually kind of co-create it themselves? So I don't know, do we want to do breakouts finally, Julia? give people.
I can roll whichever way. I've got something set up here, but what would you like? 2s, 3s, 4s?
Say 3s.
Okay.
And give me a quick break.
Yeah. So what would you like? 10, 15 minutes? We've got half an hour left.
Yeah, let's go 12.
Oh my lordy. All right. 12 minutes it is. Goodbye, everyone. I'll just check you're not allocated, Jonathan.
No, I just don't join, that's all.
Just don't join you. Okay, Jonathan, do you need a break? Off you go.
I just take a quick bathroom break and get some more to drink, and I'll be right back.
Oh, I'll do similar.
I can you hear me?
Yeah, go ahead.
So I've rejoined you from the soccer pitches in Pinelands, Cape Town, where it's very sunny and the children are playing. Yeah, but we were in group 2 and we had a very interesting discussion with Maya and Alistair, and Mark was on the call listening in, but we didn't hear his voice, unfortunately. And one of the things that I was commenting on was this idea of the linkage with the EQ competencies, and how I like the concepts of these being small things that you can take small steps and work towards them. But Alistair was bringing in, like, is it realistic? Can we bring it into organizations where we're usually working only with the leaders, and how do we bring it to the subordinates and other people in the team? So I do think for us, or, you know, part of a very short beginning discussion, that what I was enjoying was this idea of thinking about them as small steps that could be built on.
So I want to comment on that, Tessa, because that's a brilliant segue to what some of us are working on. So what's really important, we're talking about how do we democratize development to make it not the domain of leaders on executive programs, but to have an everyone culture, to have development for everyone. And what we're trying to do is build online kind of self-paced micro learning modules that people could go through very easily, and or you could group them and go through and have an online thing periodically as a group. But that, so how do we build this? So there's a link if you're curious. This is our prototype. I will put a link in the chat here. If you scroll down this page, there's a test our demo course here, and it will take you into this platform where we're using, and you'll recognize this, Penny. We've basically recreated the VCOL in practice course from Lectica in an online scalable format. And so it's a way to introduce some of these concepts and give people practices to take time with. So happy to, this is free. It's just a demo that we're using to introduce this. But it would be to get this kind of approach to micro skill development out in a scalable way in organizations. So that's one of our goals at the moment.
Yeah, I mean, one of the things that one of the courses that I did during lockdown was trained as a resilience coach, and Helena did it as well. And they've got an app, and it's a similar thing where you're kind of working on these, you know, as you say, the micro skills that all build towards your resilience.
Yeah.
Mm.
We haven't gotten to the app level yet.
Is it going to be affordable?
Yeah, but that's the whole thing. We're aiming to
Yeah.
do this to make it affordable. And right now we're looking for, how would I say, playmates to prototype and test this. And we can make things very affordable just to get more experience of trying it out in different contexts.
Absolutely. Awesome.
Very cool.
Thank you.
What I like about this way of thinking about development for everyone, and that's what Keegan was talking about with the deliberately developmental organization, is how everybody gets to start with where they are, and then it's everybody's job to continuously be a self-directed learner with the help of others. But I really like how this is really aligning with kind of my thinking of where education is going. I don't know how, I mean, and Jonathan, I know that you teach in a university, things are changing so rapidly. I don't know if universities are going to have a reason for being anymore.
Yeah. No, it's, yeah, that's
Okay,
a whole
sorry.
other question. No, but there was something you said earlier about this that, no, well, there was something.
It's going to where they are.
Yeah, and so of course, you know, we all work with assessments. So whether you're using a sentence completion or with Lectica, we use essay responses to dilemmas to get really people to show their thinking. But at the same time, we see that what we're aiming to do is to help people kind of almost self-identify what level of skill would be ideal for them to work on, teach them a learning model that is based on this very natural way that we learned as infants and then got educated out of, to reconnect to our kind of natural hits of dopamine that motivates us, that make us curious. If you can help people find the things that make them curious, then they're much more likely to practice and give them a simple structure to practice with. So this is what we're in the process of developing tools for doing.
Nice. And you know, Helena, I don't know if you're willing to share what you shared in our group, which was pretty darn brilliant and simple. Simple, but not necessarily easy.
I was saying that quite a few of my clients are involved in those 360 processes. And at the end of that, they're supposed to come up with a leadership development program for the year and choose goals or skills. And I really liked the development web. And would they be able to identify when they're functional, when they're optimal, and when they need scaffolding, and how cool that would be to use with them. Yeah.
Yes.
So I think of that in relation to the conversation I'm having with the guy that works in intellectual property and serious gaming, because we're trying to, for instance, enable ways for a team to kind of have people self-assess and have others give feedback on their performance. And you could use simple kind of criteria like that to help people have a sense of how is my performance, not just how do I think it is, but how do other people experience it?
Could I share something? One of the things we talked about was this idea of bringing we into the conversation more. And one thought was, if we look at each of the top 5 categories, if we were to continue with that, what does it mean to be in relationship to self, among others, and with others? What does it mean to have cognitive skills in discussion with others? So as separate from collaboration and relating, what if we just always look through the lens of, we're always in relationship, and very few of us are never, if any. So how do we bring that in more strongly?
And I think it's very to the point that my understanding of this work is the way Fisher set it up. It's understanding that our performance is always influenced by the relationships and context. So performance is mediated or moderated by collective sense of identity, sense of cultural norms, what is expectations of things, what is modeled in the organization. So all of these things are actually informing performance and development all the time, but we're not explicitly recognizing and taking advantage of that adequately. I don't know if we've heard from all the groups yet or not.
Jenny and Chachambo, Sarah.
Yes, I was in Jonathan's group. Yeah, we were talking about the balance and bringing sort of this we lens. I also just was kind of holding a question around, that discrete skill and that breaking apart of what those micro skills are alongside sort of that integrative function and sort of, I don't know, just appreciating that dynamic.
Well, and I think that the point in my mind is that this is, so one of the really difficult geeky books that Theo had me read, and I don't recommend it, but it's Piaget's The Development of Thought, the Equilibration of Cognitive Structures. Almost impossible to read and make sense of. But the principle is that this kind of dynamic is going on all the time. We're trying to make distinctions and differentiate something that we encounter that's kind of broad and different and other. And how do we understand what's this and that within it? How do we, so like we were listening to Brené Brown the other day, she did this massive survey. How many emotions can people actually name and recognize in the moment? On average, it's 3. So being able to make finer distinctions around our emotional states is a huge thing for resilience, robustness, performance, but that's making distinctions. So on one hand, we're breaking things down into finer categories. On the other hand, we need to connect those things that we differentiate into things that, as we connect more things in, they naturally chunk to a higher level of structure that enables us to draw on that robust network with a simple kind of trigger. Alistair.
Sure. I'm of the belief that these principles are not accessible for people who are not yet self-authoring, or if we use Suzanne's model, a leader on the self-protecting and conformist stage. That's my current view. So if that view is true, how do I engage a leader to be interested in even listening to me? Because I'm going to be the one who's crazy, even suggesting this to them. Also linked to that, currently with the recession that's looming, inflation, etc., they'll tell you, I don't have time for this, because that's a reality. I'm dealing with Russia, Ukraine pressures, etc., in the UK, rising prices and all of that stuff. what are the odds that a leader is willing to listen to you?
That's a whole different conversation of how you sell and engage leaders to find their pain point where they recognize that they're heading towards a cliff and they need help doing something about it. And that's a very different conversation, I think.
Please, can you come back and do a session on how to sell this stuff?
Well, but we'll see, maybe. But back to your earlier point about the developmental complexity. So remember, in this model, performance is variable. And my experience is I understand what you mean, that it's easy to speak over the head, but this is where we need to be agile in terms of learning to adapt our language. And to me, this is about listening skills. You have to ask good questions, hear how the person's talking, and make bridges to the language they're using, tap into the conceptions that are real for them and see, how can I stretch that and introduce something that catches their interest? Because anybody can become curious. And if they become curious, then you have a chance to say, well, let's try this out. How would this look? What would be practical for you to try practicing whatever?
Great, thank you.
Jonathan's wondering about the possibility of having coaches with more complex lens, keeping that in the background, starting a simple model for our clients. You bet. This is the challenge. We all turn on the fire hose for our clients because we want to show how clever we are.
Maybe they don't need to know there are 23.
No.
But maybe it's helpful for us.
Oh. So the demo that I showed there, it's meant to introduce a very kind of simple, basic stuff, give people very simple, easy skills to practice in a micro level, broken down in specific ways. And I do try to introduce a little bit more stuff, but the idea is we're trying to kind of capture a normative range, people that are intelligent enough to understand, but it's not so geeky that it's only for a bunch of coaches. Speaking of geeky things though, before our time is up momentarily, I thought I would put this in. So I was able to host a conversation between Peter Senge and Theo Dawson. They just met each other like moments before this conversation, and it was really interesting and engaging. Theo Dawson is brilliant. She's one of the people I've learned the most from in this area in the recent years. I think I've been working with her stuff for about 8 years now. And of course, Peter's a wonderful person who really exemplifies this ability to be profoundly simple and not get caught up in all the complexity and yet still be able to engage it. So I see our time is almost up, Julia.
Yeah. Jonathan, do you want to answer any last questions?
I could, of course, I could answer a last question.
Or
I could do something else. I could show that thing that I was going to show you. So just to leave you with an idea of how do our conceptions develop. If we look at the idea of truth, when I say that word now, that means that activates something in your neural network that's implicit for you, that's developed for you. But now think of a 6-year-old. And what is true is there are 3 apples in front of me, not 4. It's very concrete. So Fisher's skill scale that I was talking about before, if we look at this, we can see that truth starts out at, and this is now taking these levels and breaking them down to a quarter of a level. So the conception, the word truth, and this is based on empirical data of like 40 or 50,000 performances and looking, calibrating in relation to this. My wife actually got to intern with Theo and work on this dictionary for a while. So that's 7C, A, B, C, D. Not the truth is slightly more complex. Now, really the truth is at level 8, and level 8 is taking two representations and mapping them. No, it's actually making a system of representation. I'm sorry, level 7 is two representations, and yeah, because it's these concrete things are what we say, and you're mapping those two representations, and it's truth. At 8, you have a system, you say it's really the truth. And then a little more complex, it's the truth when, and it's the truth even, unless, or it's kind of the truth, and you see to get to the limits of representational thinking. And at level 9, you pop into an abstraction. To be truthful is an abstract conception of the idea of truth. And then you go through the same thing, finding the truth or the whole truth or truthfully. And then you get to mapping two abstractions and see the ugly truth or a grain of truth. And this is a way of looking at how micro development happens and how we can look at the structure of language and how that represents what kind of thinking tools are active for a person. So instead of answering a question, I gave you a little teaser. And there's a dictionary with 1 million of these phrases in it.
Where can we find that dictionary?
Well, you don't find the dictionary. It's the intellectual property of Lectica, but it's what they use to do developmental assessments. So what you're asked to do is say, here's a dilemma, what's important and why? And you write out and you elaborate 500,000 words. Then you say, what would you do and why? And you do another 500 or 1,000 words. And how would you come to a decision? What else could you do? What would be, you really show how you think. And the dictionary can map that and look at this range of complexity. It's really like geeky. I'll show you the really geeky. Penny will probably have seen this. This is the way the computer, which scores more accurately than its creator, creates a matrix. And it's hard to see the details, but you see that because we don't use complex words all the time, we use a combination of words across the spectrum. And it gets really geeky where you get to not just 1/4 of a level, but 1/20th of a level. But if you look at how the computer sees development through our language, you see that at these early levels, it's mostly just on that level. But as you progress up, you include a broader range. And then what's super interesting here is that you see that people use words they don't understand. Because in this kind of community, we read and get exposed to stuff and we talk with it, but we don't actually know how to operate on it. We don't know what to do with it, how to perform that level of thinking. And so what happens is you end up with jargon, inflating scores, but the computer has cleaned that up now. So that's a whole nother conversation. And then Penny put the, you can find tons of resources related to all this stuff in the link that Penny put in the chat.
Yeah. I love this stuff, Jonathan. And it's really a huge honor, actually, that you would spend your holidays with us.
Yeah, but a chance to talk about stuff you care about, that's a holiday.
Well, still. Thank you. So thank you so very, very much for that. It's always illuminating and broadening to spend time with you in the best possible way. And just to also let people know, we're hoping to have you back in November. maybe with some students.
Yes, that is something we can set up. I love to, so I teach a course in coaching for a master's in counseling program. And after Julie and I got to know each other last year, and I did one, oh, that would be fun to do and invite my students. So see you, Penny. Oh, there she had to go.
Yeah.
Yes, and Jonathan's seen the article where it they scored the interview. So not a speech because that's written, but an interview, a person has to talk. And they looked at the transcripts of the interviews of 4 presidents, Bush, Clinton, Obama, and Trump, and use this system to rate it. And if you look on Medium, you can find this. And it's not surprising how certain people rated.
Very interesting. So thank you very much. And I think Sarah Ann, you're on the next supervision call, aren't you? So we look forward to that. And thank you, Jonathan. It's so lovely to see you. Would you mind staying on just for 2 seconds,
Sure,
and then
no
I can let you
problem.
go back
No
and mow
problem.
your lawn?
And I just want to say thanks to everybody for showing up and engaging so much. You had great questions and let me be geeky about stuff. And